Let's find common ground. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Florian Glatz, founder of Common Ground, the place to build communities and connect with like-minded people in Web3. Today, I'm talking to Tiago Sada, head of product engineering and design at Tools for Humanity. Tools for Humanity is the key contributor to Worldcoin, a global identity project that was co-founded by OpenAI's Sam Altman. Tiago, it's a huge pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Conversation.
Awesome. Tiago, I'm sure there's a lot more to say about you as a person, and so I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself in your own words, the way you please.
For sure. Yeah. I think you just gave like a very fancy title that doesn't really mean anything. In practice, what I do is I oversee a bunch of the software that we build at TFH to make the Worldcoin project possible. And so we can talk about these components later on, but things like the app, the World app that users are signing up with, the app that operators use, the SDK for developers, the protocols, things like that. I work with a bunch of teams doing that. Before that, I'm actually originally from Mexico. I grew up in Mexico City, lived there most of my life. I just, growing up, I started building robots with friends. Through that, I was able to get a scholarship to study college in the US. So I went to the US to study computer science and robotics engineering. Actually ended up dropping out halfway through to start a startup with the same friends I used to build robots with. Turns out that was just more fun. We went through YC with that, and that's actually how I originally met Sam. And then we went different directions. I eventually sold my startup and did a bunch of random stuff. And then I heard about WorldCoin about 2 years ago. I joined the project to help out with a bunch of things.
Okay, cool. So a really interesting background that you have, and clearly some hardware element in this, which I think is crucial also to WorldCoin's mission. We'll touch on that in a moment, but before we get there, I like to ask my guests about their personal journey into Web3/crypto. And so Web3 is quite a rabbit hole. And once you end up in it, it's really hard to get out or think about anything else. And so I would love to hear how you sort of found this Web3 world and how you got here.
Well, you could say I come from the dark side. My startup was a fintech in Mexico. And so what we were doing was very similar to something like Alipay for Latin America, where you could have peer-to-peer payments, QR payments in stores, you could pay your bills, phone top-ups, things like that. Right? And so when we were building that, this was during 2017, 2018, there was a bull market and blockchain was like the buzzword, right? And like all investors would ask us, like the first thing is like, are you using blockchain for your startup? And like the first time we thought about it, we discussed it, and like actually back then it did not make sense to use a blockchain for something like we were doing. We were doing real-time payments, an emerging market. You wanted something to be super cheap, super fast. Maybe today you could do that with an L2 or something like that, but back then it didn't make sense. And so I actually had to get really good at explaining why blockchains did not make sense. And so once I was not working on that and I had some mental space, I kept having like random ideas of things to build next. And a bunch of them were things that they made sense, but not in a world where like crypto succeeded, right? Or like, this is a really good idea, but if crypto works out, actually you would build this in a different way. And so I hit that wall a couple of times. And I eventually just said like, you know what, like I need to like sort of make up my mind, right? Like, will crypto work or not? Because if it does, then I should just be doing that instead. And if it doesn't, then I should just build these things and like bet that crypto won't pan out. And so where in the past I had approached crypto from like the tokens perspective and like trading and things like that, and the idea of buying coffee with Bitcoin never really resonated with me. The second time around, through a friend, I actually ended up getting through the smart contracts and Ethereum route of things, just thinking about things as protocols and tokens just being, yes, sometimes they can be values of exchange, but other times they can have different functions, right? And so through that, I got into the rabbit hole and I was just fascinated by both the technology and the values, and just how ultimately you could build just objectively superior products with crypto, right? When you have things like the composability of Ethereum, you don't really need to care about decentralization. It's just you can build the same product in 3 weeks instead of in 3 months or 3 years that you would in like the old world, right? And so that I think is undeniable. And so that's really what got me into the rabbit hole. And then from there, bunch of different things, and then for random things in life, ended up at Worldcoin as well.
So interesting. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of Ethereum, and I love that you mentioned it because it's really this new platform really to build on, and it solves the decentralization problem for you in a sense, at least for applications and those kinds of things. So I totally get your perspective on this. And now you're at this Worldcoin project, and obviously now Worldcoin is, I think, leveraging Ethereum even as part of its
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, crypto is still far away. I don't know if you agree, but it feels far away today, at least from mainstream adoption. I can say that, my own family doesn't really use it. I'm the only one who's really doing on-chain transactions every day and so on. So it seems like normies are not yet really using it. What do you believe will be this sort of breakthrough moment for crypto? What does it take? How will we get there? What's your perspective on it?
Well, I mean, there will certainly have to be a catalyst, right? There will be some specific use case or some specific application that will just be the thing that takes it mainstream. I think it's very difficult to predict what that is. It might be WorldCoin, might be something else. But I would say I've actually been surprised when you take a very opinionated approach to building consumer level user interfaces on top of the primitives that already exist. I think we're actually much farther ahead than people think. The problem isn't really that Uniswap, for example, is not useful for normal people, is that having to use it through the same tools that we use because we want control over every single thing and we want to understand every single thing that we're signing. And that is a part that I would argue is the most broken. And so a lot of the thinking that we have to do in our day-to-days is not just, okay, how do we get the technology to a point where it's actually scalable and ready for mass consumption, but actually just how do you shape products, whether it's on what you include, but most importantly on what you don't include on those products, to actually build use cases and shape the use cases that make a lot more sense for people, right? And so I think, having said that, there will have to be some like boom moments, some big bang, where some application that happens to use crypto behind the scenes to give some new sort of value to the world that hasn't been possible before, and then everything will go from that.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. And in terms of your feeling for that, is that going to be, more likely to be, let's say, in gaming, or is that more likely going to be in something more financial, like, stable coins? Many people say that's actually the breakthrough innovation behind crypto. Where's your feeling where it's more likely going to be?
Yeah, for sure, super bullish on stable coins. I think that just the mental effort or the mental leap to get people to start paying things with different currencies, like it might come, but I think that a lot of the benefits of crypto, both philosophical and technological, we can get with stablecoins, right? As long as they're built in the right way. And so being able to just keep paying with Mexican pesos when you go and buy a Coke, like that is so valuable for people. And denominating your savings in Mexican pesos, you can still get a lot of the benefits from this new world. And so I do think that stable coins are a really important innovation when it comes to DeFi. Look, I don't know if a finance app will go viral, right? Like, yeah, maybe a game could go viral. We'll see. I do think that from a growth model perspective, though, which I don't think we've gotten right as a crypto ecosystem, but the idea of using tokens to bootstrap networks, I do think is very powerful, right? When you go back to fundamentals and you start thinking like, okay, what would have happened if a Uber competitor was giving equity to their drivers, right? You can definitely see how that would bootstrap an Uber competitor. And so I do think that just from a growth model perspective, just like SEO was a thing at some point and ads were a thing at some point, I do think that bootstrapping networks will be a very big deal, and tokens just make that a lot easier, right? So for very famously, Airbnb even tried giving their hosts equity when they were IPOing. It was just too complicated to do, and so they weren't able to do it. But that might also just end up being one of the most important consequences that enables crypto to get adoption.
I couldn't agree more, actually. At Common Ground, which is the platform that I'm building, we're having exactly this vision of building a social network where the equity is as much as possible equally distributed among the users who use that social platform, right? And it's how you would bootstrap, let's say, a Facebook competitor in this new world, right? But then uh, there is a lot of trust, I think, that we have to make up for, given all the recent developments in the space, where I just hear so many people being critical about crypto and its value proposition, just because we've had so many bust cycles now that it's sort of, yeah, it's an uphill battle, I think, to make people trust this narrative that it's for something good and not just for people enriching themselves. That's my personal experience when I talk to people.
Yeah, I think we're just going to have to get to a point where a token is like a website, right? There's good websites and bad websites, and websites perform different functions, and tokens are the same, right? I think like the word cryptocurrency is very tricky because it implies that every token is the same and that every token is meant to be a medium of exchange, right? And so I think that's where we lose a lot of people. But when you get into the nuance of, yeah, some websites and the .com bust were like scammy or didn't make sense, and other ones made a lot of sense. I think it's the same thing with tokens, right? You just need to like we need to cut through the noise and just be able to talk about individual projects on their own and individual tokens of their own, rather than just this basket of cryptocurrencies.
Do you have sort of an explanation of? Some people say that, well, crypto is not a young technology anymore. It's been around for over a decade. If there was a use case, you guys should have found it by now. There clearly isn't one. Do you have a good reason of why it just takes so long to find this, or do you think it's actually normal? What's your feeling on that?
Well, I actually do think that just the technology was not ready for mainstream for a long time. Like it was an R&D problem. Even something like Worldcoin would not have been possible 2 years ago with the state of crypto. Things like just volumes that you can process, the speed of transactions. There's just very basic things that make it's very difficult to even get feature parity with current systems, whether you're talking about finance or gaming or identity. With all of these things, crypto systems were clearly inferior. And so I think we're getting to a point of technical maturity where we can now at least have feature parity. And then now it's a conversation of, okay, now let's show off all of the power, right? This is global by default, this is digital by default, and what are the implications of those? I think we're just starting to get to that point, but the technology just wasn't ready. Just like smartphones were technically a thing before the iPhone, but like they weren't really a thing until the iPhone because the tech wasn't there yet.
I like that point. Let's talk about Worldcoin a little bit, because there's just so much to discuss and we don't have too much time. So want to segue into this. Now, to all the listeners who don't know Worldcoin, this is a very widely discussed project in the crypto space at the moment, at least in my bubble. I don't know if it's like that for everybody. And quite controversially so. There are people who believe the project is building important infrastructure that will power the next generation of applications in finance and beyond. And there are people who believe that WorldCoin is pursuing a fundamentally flawed idea that carries all kinds of risks and abuse for potential for abuse. I'll be impartial in this interview. What I really want to do is give you, Tiago, a chance to answer some questions, give your vision on this project while you're working on it. And my first question in that sense would be to you: what is your vision for WorldCoin? And of course, what is WorldCoin in the first place? And how do you see it evolving over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe?
Yeah, well, quite a question. Let's just get started. So I think to understand WorldCoin, you have to understand why it started in the first place. And so WorldCoin started around 4 years ago. It was co-invented by Sam at OpenAI. And what happened back then was when they were working on all the cool stuff that we're now getting to play with, all of the GPTs and different models, it became very clear to Sam that regardless of whether it was going to be OpenAI or someone else, advanced AI was coming, number one, and it was coming much sooner than people expected. So some people said it was never going to come, other people said it would, but in 50 years. And what Sam at least believed back then was like, no, this is a 5 to 10 year type of thing. And that's going to be the most powerful technology we will probably ever build as humanity. It's going to come with new questions, right? And so just like the internet gave us a bunch of new benefits, it also had new challenges that we had to tackle, right? Or just different, even philosophical questions that we have to ask ourselves. Okay, how do we want to approach this as a society? And so there's a couple of those that are particularly interesting. Number one is how do you democratize something like advanced AI systems, right? And what I mean by that is, how do you make sure everyone has fair access to it, right? Because it's super unfair if only a few people get the superpowers, but others don't. But number two, if these are truly such powerful models, how can you start thinking about decentralizing or democratizing their governance, right, and their control? So that was one bucket of things. A second bucket of things is the economic bucket, right, which is very important. There's clearly going to be some transition period between the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. And there is a question of, okay, how can you make that transition as smooth as possible? And more importantly, even in that new world, right, like all of this economic value that is generated by AI systems, how do you distribute that fairly? Right? And I think that things like UBI might be an answer to both of those problems. Right? And then the third bucket of things is what we call proof of personhood, which is, well, in a world where anything can be faked online, how do you know who and what to trust, right? How do you know if these 20,000 Twitter accounts are 20,000 people or 20,000 bots with just like some guy in a basement with an LLM? And so when you think about all of those problems, the intersection is really two things, right? It is number one, identity, digital identity, and number two, it is digital money. And a lot of times people ask me like, hey, is Worldcoin about money or about identity? It's both, right? Because yes, at its core, it's going to be hopefully the largest network of real people, just like Facebook is a network. But then just like in Facebook, one of the native operations that you can do is send pictures or send chats. In Worldcoin, we believe that sending money is a very important primitive. Because when you solve those two problems, when you have digital identity that is provable, especially online, and you have digital money that you can transact with, whether it's between people or with digital systems, you actually have the tools to tackle these three problems that we really care a lot about, but then also a bunch of other problems, both future problems and just very mundane problems of today, right? Like something as simple as like, how do you give people a free trial for your software without them double dipping? And so Volcom really started with saying, okay, let's solve these problems. And the really crazy idea back then was to say, okay, let's start by just making a cryptocurrency that every person can claim a part of simply for being a human, right? And that will force us to solve the personhood problem. It also allows us to have this asset that was distributed in a fair way. You can then use that token to actually then govern the network itself. Right? And so this thing that we were talking about, bootstrapping the ecosystem, uh, the, the token is both useful, but like after bootstrapping, but also to bootstrap the network, right? And we started working on this. The trickiest problem was solving the personhood problem. Was like it turns out that actually proving that someone is a real person in a way in which they cannot cheat is a very difficult problem. And so we tried a bunch of things from the beginning. We started with things like email or phone verification. It turns out like those are obviously too easy to cheat. Then we moved over to try things like KYC, right? Which a bunch of financial providers use around the world. But it turns out that's not just not private at all, which we didn't like. It just doesn't scale. It's not inclusive. It's not fraud resistant at all. And more than half the population doesn't have an ID that you can verify digitally. And so after that, we looked at things like Web of Trust, which are really interesting systems. You just happen to need a really large set of users you can trust initially. And so Worldcoin might just end up scaling with Web of Trust. We'll see. And at the end, we just realized that the fundamental answer was biometrics, right? At the end of the day, the most reliable way to distinguish humans between each other today is biometrics. And so then we had to tackle the challenge of, okay, how can you verify biometrics in a way that is scalable, in a way that is privacy preserving, and in a way that is just actually feasible to do, right? And so we did like 2 years of R&D, and out of that came a device that's very famous on Twitter. It's called the Orb. And it's a really cool device. We can talk about that more for a bit. On top of that, we build a protocol that is called World ID. It's a decentralized identity protocol that actually allows you to use these attestations. And then on top of that, we build an app called World App, which basically takes all of this cool technology and merges it with Ethereum. And it actually is like a friendly, useful consumer software product that people can use today without having to understand everything else, but preserving the self-custody, preserving the privacy, preserving the decentralization, all of these different properties of the system. And so that is where we're at today. Worldcoin is still in beta, and we can talk about what that beta has been like. We are getting close to launch. So far in the beta, about 1.7 million people have signed up using an orb. And yeah, so we can dive into any part of this that you are excited to hear about. And yeah, excited to launch in general.
Wow, so that's a mouthful. To repeat, you have Sam has seen the problem that comes with AI in terms of proving that you're actually a human. This will become necessary now with what OpenAI is building, and I think other quite capable companies, as well as the open source space at this point, which has also become quite sophisticated, I believe. To tackle this problem, you realize there is actually no other way of proving one's humanness than to do it through a biometric process. And so as a result of this, you've developed this unique hardware called the orb that can be used to do this verification process. You mentioned that UBI would be a potential use case for this. More broadly, what are the use cases that you are most excited about? And maybe in terms of the UBI, can you give us an idea of how UBI could run on this Worldcoin platform?
Well, I think that you can think of the Worldcoin ecosystem in general as infrastructure for UBI, right? We wouldn't call the ongoing token distribution in certain countries a UBI because like it's just like not something you can live off, right? And it's not designed to be that. That is a separate, that is to decentralize the network. But fundamentally, right, what we're doing is we're putting in everyone's hands a self-custodial wallet that runs on Ethereum and a self-custodial ID, which starts with a proof of personhood. And so with those tools, any government, nonprofit, for-profit company that wants to distribute value can use those rails to issue UBI with different rules, right? And so someone could take these primitives and say, you know what, every month, anyone that is a real person can claim $10 from this bucket of cash, right? And so you're able to trustlessly execute that airdrop in a way in which you know you're not going to get defrauded, but at the same time preserves the privacy of the people, right? And so we're building that infrastructure. And look, I think that in some cases it'll be governments that can do not just UBI. I think that's like the highest part of things, right? But even just regular social welfare programs, right? There is generally not infrastructure around the world, and you're not just talking about the poorest countries. You're talking generally in the world. It's very common for people to either not have a bank account or not have an ID that you can use digitally.
In terms of solving unique problems, you've answered it in a sense, but just to reiterate on this, you said that Worldcoin solves this problem of proof of humanity, and in your research, you found that there is no other potential system to solve this. Now, there are some people who indeed believe in this web of trust approach. There are people who talk about social verification. So I've talked to Clément from Proof of Humanity, who's building this. They are of a different opinion. Do you think there is a difference of opinion, or are you actually of the same opinion here? Where is the real different perspective here? Maybe you can help me to understand.
No, for sure. So I think something that's very important to highlight, which I sort of brushed over, is the orb, essentially this device that can issue you this proof of personhood, right? But fundamentally, you're right. Like, in fact, in all likelihood, there's some other better way or some other better device than the orb to issue proof of personhood, right? And so while that is the first device that the Worldcoin network supports, the actual protocol itself, which is called World ID, is agnostic to the type of verification. Right? Like the idea is World ID is a protocol that allows people to receive proof of personhoods and then use those to accumulate some sort of reputation about themselves and then be able to make statements in a private way about that reputation. And so For example, even if you do say that the best way to go about this is iris biometrics, which from our research, that's what we think nowadays, you probably want to have a bunch of people doing that, not just one company, right? And so actually one of the really important steps to decentralizing the network is there has to be other companies or other nonprofits that are issuing their own iris verification credentials on the protocol that don't use the orbs. Right? And so this is actually part of why the orb hardware is open source. It's not just for transparency, it's to help others bootstrap their efforts of building other devices. Now, that's not just true for alternative iris verification devices, that's also true for alternative methods of verification. So for example, today the protocol already supports, the first additional signal that it supports is phone number verification. Because there's very clearly much less friction in verifying an SMS than in going to a device and verifying your biometrics. And for certain use cases, if you verify the phone number, that's enough. So now the question is everywhere between phone number and orb, right? There's a lot of space to explore there. And we as TFH are doing a lot of explorations there. And I think that Web of Trust is a really interesting idea. It's just, we believe it's not feasible, or from our research, we don't believe it's feasible until you have a really large set of users you can trust. So you could even make an argument that the best way to bootstrap a Web of Trust is to have a bunch of users use the orb, and then you use those to then build a Web of Trust on top of. But yeah, I'm sure there's new ideas like privacy preserving KYC or a bunch of different methods. And hopefully what we will see is you can start getting all of these different types of attestations through the World ID protocol. And at the end of the day, we will see, right? We will see what ended up being the strongest signal. Having said that, while the protocol is agnostic, at least us as TFH, we are quite focused on the biometric verification, because after 3 years and some change of trying a bunch of different other things, we just think this is the only thing that is private, that scales, that is fraud resistant, that just checks all the boxes. And so we actually have a blog post on the website. It's called Humanness in the Age of AI. So if people are curious to read like a quite technical walkthrough of different things that we've tried, that's available there.
Interesting answer. So what I derive from this is that from your point of view, the real important part of Worldcoin is the protocol. It's not really necessarily this orb device that you are currently using to create these attestations of proof of humanity. It's actually, there could be a range of different providers using different methods to contribute to this protocol, which is then in some sense available to organizations, governments, and anyone else who needs this reliable infrastructure of unique people that they can address for different applications. Is that a right understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a fair understanding. Again, I don't want to take a cop out and say like the orb is not important. Like, no, we think the orb is a fundamental answer, at least the best one that we found today, which is why we spend a lot of time. You can imagine that making hardware and taking it around the world is not super easy. But we also believe that it's important that on a protocol level, the protocol is neutral, the protocol is agnostic, and the protocol is open to our small team being wrong, right? And so hopefully, and actually, yeah, over the coming weeks and months, we should start seeing a bunch of other people issue attestations on the protocol.
Let's talk about protocol governance then for a moment, because it then, in this case, then it shouldn't be necessarily you, Worldcoin, who decide who gets to be an accreditation entity on this protocol. There probably should be some sort of, I don't know, DAO maybe, or some other kind of body that decides who is trustworthy, I suppose, to be allowed to issue these certificates on the protocol. What's your plan there? And is that in any way linked to this Worldcoin Foundation that was recently launched?
Worldcoin was originally invented or conceived inside of TFH, right? This is the company or the startup that Sam and Alex co-founded a few years ago. Since then, a bunch of other companies nowadays also contribute to the protocol. And what has happened, and it's an ongoing process, is all of the IP and all of the governance, things like the treasury, anything that should belong to the protocol rather than a specific company, either has already or is in the process of being transferred from TFH to the Worldcoin Foundation. The Worldcoin Foundation is a nonprofit that is independent. That mission is to scale the Worldcoin protocol, and one of its most important tasks is to figure out the governance fit. Now, realistically, that probably means trying to minimize the governance that is required in the first place, right? But then for the few things that do require governance, the foundation will be the one setting up those mechanisms. Now, it'll be an interesting challenge, right? Because there's when you're trying to build a network with everyone in the world in it, there's just like not really been, not just in DAOs, but in general, governance challenges at that scale. So a really cool thing is that, yes, you have the Worldcoin token as a primitive that might help you facilitate things in governance, but you also, for the first time, have the primitive of proof of personhood, right? And so you can start doing things like one person, one vote, conviction voting, or you can start mixing up things and do quadratic voting. So this opens up the design space of how you can approach the governance of such a protocol. But fundamentally, in general, to your question of who can issue attestations, actually anyone should be able to issue attestations. And so World ID is not just decentralized, it's not just open source, it's actually permissionless. Now, I'm sure there will be layers on top of the protocol, right? Like SDKs that might be opinionated about which credentials it exposes to developers or things like that. But at a protocol level, that should be as neutral as possible.
Very, very interesting. I'm learning a lot, and I feel the time just passing way too quickly. So I have loads of questions, and I also asked in my Twitter timeline, because there are so many Worldcoin critics, what their most burning questions are. So I will have a bunch of them also to ask. But before I get there, I just want to talk a little bit about the public perception of Worldcoin, which at least it seems mixed. I think there are people who love the project. There are people who criticize it harshly. Edward Snowden famously tweeted at you saying, "Don't use biometrics for anything." You know, you're a startup, obviously. I mean, you have some amazing people in there like Sam who are not doing this for the first time in a sense, but nonetheless, you're a startup and startups make mistakes. From your perspective, what are the biggest mistakes you've done so far as a startup?
We've made a lot of them, I think that's for sure. I think perhaps the biggest mistake or the most unfortunate thing is that we just honestly sucked at telling the story for a long time. The project leaked at some point. I don't even remember, it was last year when it was. We weren't like ready to talk about it. This was, and so we just didn't do a good job telling the story. Right? And so I think that as much as we are very confident about things like the privacy guarantees of the system or the decentralization roadmap that we have, or the bar that we have for a lot of things across the board, perception also does matter, right? And so I think that a lot of the work that we've done as a team in the past year or whatever it is has been just been getting better at explaining to people what we're doing. And if you still don't like it, that's great, right? Like you don't have to use it, but at least just trying to get people the facts right. Because there's honestly just a lot of counterintuitive things, right? Like when you hear you're scanning your eyes to get free crypto, like A, that sounds a little bit weird. And B, if you're technical, it's actually the most obvious implementations for something like this are actually incredibly terrifying on a privacy level. And so it takes actually diving into the technical details and understanding the nuances of how the CK zero knowledge proofs work and how the protocol is separated from the orb and is separated from the wallet. So it takes understanding a lot of nuances to see why it's truly privacy preserving, for example. But that is not something that you can always fit in a tweet. Right? And so a lot of the work that we've had to do is just figure out, okay, what is the best way to tell this story in different levels of resolution, depending on how deep people want to go.
There's a saying in crypto, and it's probably not even emerged in crypto. It's trust but verify, right? And this is something that people like in crypto. You can run your own node, you can verify all transactions. In terms of WorldCoin, how can people verify that the things you're saying are actually, the way they are? It's privacy preserving, there's zero knowledge, the hardware, I don't know, isn't wiretapped by the NSA or whatever. Like, what verification opportunities are there for people to do their own research as they like to do?
That's a super important question because like this whole Google approach of like don't be evil just doesn't work, right? Like what works nowadays is just can't be evil. And so everything that we design it to just make it impossible for us to be evil or us to be dumb, to be honest. And so there's look, I can talk at a very high level. This means like open sourcing as much as possible, executing as many things as possible on public blockchains rather than on private servers. It means having audits. It means a bunch of things like that. Now, specifically, there is a really good blog post on the Worldcoin website. It's called something like Privacy Technical Deep Dive. And at the end, it has a section that is literally how can you verify these claims. And it's probably like something like 15 to 20 bullet points of just like on a technical level, how can you verify all of these different things, right? Whether the monitoring the networking from the packages, from the orbs, a bunch of different things. And so what I would say is that blog post is, as the title implies, is part one of a series of blog posts. But the bulk of these questions, or the most important ones, we tried to tackle already in the first one. And so people can check that out, and then any questions they can just like join the Discord and ask them more, or shoot an email, or shoot a tweet. But it is very important that that you don't have to trust us actually.
A lot of people in the crypto space love to talk about public goods. It's sort of become a meme almost. There is obviously Gitcoin that is specialized in public goods funding. It's a huge movement. And also me personally, I find it a really cool idea. Is in your mind Worldcoin a public good today or at some point in the future? Is it built for that or is it something else?
I mean, 100%, right? And I think that that is different from some of the products that Tools for Humanity might build, right? So for example, there's this app called World App, right? That is the first wallet that is supported, that supports the Worldcoin ecosystem. That is a product by a company, yes, to push the ecosystem forward, but that will be a product, right? For-profit product, and that's fine. But the Worldcoin project, the World ID protocol, the token, like the actual protocol itself, it not just can or should, like that's the only thing it can be to succeed. If it's not truly open infrastructure, I mean, I think public goods is a very new term for it. I would just call it public infrastructure, right? It's running water. It's a phone booth on the corner. If it's not like that, then the Worldcoin project failed. It's as simple as that.
That's a powerful statement. Now, I want to tie this into the fundraising that you've done recently. Congrats on that, by the way. You've been raising $115 million approximately, I think, or closing that round recently in a market that is very tough. I think many builders envy you for that. How do you fundraise that amount of money for a public good? Or was that for the for-profit parts? How do you square this in a sense, in a way that is attractive to investors, but does not prevent you from fulfilling this promise?
Uniswap is a real example of this. One of the really cool things about tokens is it allows you to make something into a public good while also using the value of that public good itself to make it possible in the first place. And so, for example, Uniswap, I don't remember the exact breakdown, but I think it's something like 49% of the value went to the investors that made it possible and to the team that made it possible, and 51% of it goes to the world, right? Which by 49-51 makes it a public good, right? And so from there you have a gradient of okay, how public versus how like much privately held it is, right? You can imagine even when you like see a garden on a park, right? It might have like a stick that says like, hey, this park is maintained by X or Y company, right? That is like giving that company value, right? It's like advertising value. That's why they're doing that. But it's still clearly the park is a public good, right? And so it allows to bring that stick on the yard to just technology, right? And digital public goods. And so that is what we've seen with generally any type of protocol that has open source or that has decentralized. And Worldcoin is one more of those, right? And so what we're trying to accomplish with the way the protocol is set up, and we'll have much more to share on like a tokenomics post soon, is we're trying to maximize the amount of value that can go out to the world rather than the amount of value that is needed to make it viable. And so with the project, what we've been able to achieve is something like 75, around that order of magnitude, percent of its value can go to the world, while only taking 25% of what it will hopefully be worth to make it possible in the first place, right? Now, I think that a lot of times we get questions like, well, why are you raising at like the valuations you are? Well, that's simply because we're trying to maximize the amount of ownership that we can give to the world, right? Like for us, it would be a lot easier to fundraise lower amounts, but then we would have less to give to the world. So that's one thing that's funny to see. The other one is just always a question of like, well, why 20 or 25 or 30 or 40 for other crypto projects rather than zero, right? Well, because we also like need to build the thing, right? And in the case of Worldcoin specifically, that takes R&D, that takes operations in the real world, that takes hardware devices. And so I'm personally super excited. Like if I were to hear that Facebook was 80% owned by its users, I think so. And so that's how the fundraising works. But yeah, we've been super fortunate to work with like great partners that believe in the project, and we'll be able to maximize all of the value that we'll be able to give to the world.
I mean, just from my personal point of view, also trying to build a public good with common ground, I know exactly the issue of wanting to give everything to the world, but then also you need to build it in the first place. It needs capital. So you need to strike a balance. And I find if you found this 25-75 split, that's pretty powerful and speaks to your fundraising abilities. So well done on that one. I will jump through a bunch of questions that I've collected from Common Ground, where I ask people to give me questions, from Twitter. In terms of the algorithms that you're training to recognize whether an iris and a scan of, like, I looked at the data you're scanning. It's not just the iris. You also take some sort of heartbeat and a lot of biometric data with this orb. Are these algorithms going to be part of the public good part, or are they part of the private for-profit part? And maybe more broadly, the orb itself as a device, is this part of the public good, or is it part of the for-profit venture?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And first, just to give some context on the orb. So the orb has three jobs, right? Its first job is actually probably its hardest and is the one that is the most underrated, which is just making sure that you're a real person that is alive, that isn't trying to cheat. And so for that, the orb has a bunch of sensors, like you're mentioning, like infrared cameras and depth sensors and a bunch of things to make sure that you are a real person. The second task is to actually check for uniqueness, right? Which is where it generates your iris code. And then the third part is actually verifying all of this. Now, the cool thing about the setup of the orb is, and why it took so long to develop, is that all of these different checks can happen on device. So today the orb runs 8 different neural networks on device, and there will probably be a lot more soon. And so all of these sensor input is actually processed locally on the orb. And by default, the only thing that needs to leave the device is that iris code to make sure that you only can verify once. Now, people can optionally check a different box that says like, help improve Worldcoin by sharing my data. And then your data is encrypted, or some of your data, a lot of it is still deleted. And then we can use that for training. But I think it is important to clarify that the default case is that all of the sensor data that the orb uses, there's actually a lot of technology that goes into making sure that doesn't even touch storage. If you want to get technical, it stays on memory of the device and it gets cleared. It doesn't even touch the storage of the device. Again, this is part of that blog post. But now to get to your question of the actual IP, generally speaking, the orb is part of the IP that either has or is in the process of being moved to the Worldcoin Foundation. Part of that, and a really important step in that, was actually open sourcing the hardware of the orb. And so that has a license which is open source for like responsible use. And so it's something along the lines of the foundation has to actually grant you a license to make at least production at scale. But the foundation is actually the entity that will be guarding that, and then it'll be up to the foundation to decide how it wants to turn that into more of a community governance thing. And so, yeah, just like that, essentially any type of important IP for the project will be held by the foundation and the community, essentially.
And it includes also the software and the neural nets running on the orb, not just the hardware. It's the whole package.
So again, I don't know the exact status of each of these things, I don't want to misspeak or mispromise things, but generally speaking, yes. And also, even the software, we're working really hard to open source the last few things that aren't open source there. We actually have a blog post also explaining like why it's tricky on a security perspective, but there is a path to being able to open source the firmware of the orb. And then from a verifiability perspective, there's monitoring that people can do around that, so that even if the firmware isn't open source yet, while that process happens, there's checks and balances that the community can have.
I want to go through a bunch of attack vectors that people have come up with, how they want to game the system, so to speak, which I guess is valuable. One obvious attack vector would be to sort of farm Worldcoin credentials. So maybe not too dissimilar, like how you did this initial rollout, going to many different places in the world, convincing people to sign up for Worldcoin. There could be, rogue Worldcoin operators or orb operators, I guess how you call them, who just farm a lot of credentials. They don't really give them to the people. They just sort of abuse them. And then there's one person with, let's say, 1,000 credentials. It doesn't seem too far out to imagine this. Is there any countermeasure for this, or is this just part of the problem and to be accepted? How do you look at this kind of attack vector?
It is an interesting challenge just of custodial IDs in general, right? Like if I want to like give you my physical passport, I can do that, right? And like in certain cases, you'll be able to use it. We do quite a few things to make that as hard as possible. Now, the fundamental answer is actually like if I give you my passport, the reason it might not always be useful to you is because if you try to get somewhere with it, like people will check the picture and they'll be like, no, it's a different person. Or if you go to the airport, they'll actually like check your biometrics or something related to that, right? And like that's similarly the case with World ID, where today the most basic implementation of it is you use a World ID simply by having possession of it, right? And for like a lot of use cases, in fact, probably for like 80% of use cases, that is sufficient. Actually, like one of the really cool things that we've been working on for a long time for the protocol is the ability to prove that you not just have custody of a World ID, but you're still the same person in a private way. And so there's two ways you can do that. So that let's say like the low trust, low friction version is you just have custody of it and you can use it, right? And so that's for, I don't know, liking a video on YouTube. Then the second degree, let's say like middle friction, but also middle trust, would be face verification. We've actually been working quite a bit on a flow in which will overall very similar to World ID, where locally on device you will be able to take a selfie that will get compared to the World ID that was verified by the orb that is only custodied on your device. And so you can prove, again, in a privacy preserving way, that you are still right now the same person that got issued this World ID. Now, there are potentially some attack vectors when people are taking selfies versus when you're like in a government office, right? And so there is a third, which is like the highest level of trust, but highest level of verification as well, which is you can just simply like re-verify your biometrics, right? So you can imagine like if you want to take out a mortgage, right? Well, the bank or the airport could have a device that allows it to verify your iris, but without them having to receive your iris and without breaking all the zero knowledge proofs, right? It would be really easy to do this in a non-private way. Part of the reason why we haven't rolled out all of these things is because we want to make sure that at every step of the way, just like the ID, all of this data is self-custodial, this process on device, all of these different things. And so on a protocol level, today we're just focused on use cases where having custody of it is sufficient, right? This is why you don't see us promoting people getting a mortgage today with World ID. But as these different components get rolled out that allow people not just to prove that they have custody of the ID, but to re-authenticate on the spot, that really hardens that. And so it really breaks a lot of these different attack vectors.
Yeah, that breaks a lot of attack vectors and answers a lot of other similar questions that I had received, like if a person dies, can someone else use their credential? Well, as long as you just need to show possession of the credential, you can, but as soon as you need to re-authenticate, either through a selfie or through an actual biometric check, that wouldn't work. So I suppose that answers that. A user I really like and respect, Sebastian. He said he wonders whether you're aware of what's called Goodhart's law, which says that when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. So I think that means, well, as soon as you take, let's say, irises as a proof for humanity, they stop being a good proof for humanity because they are a target for people to attack. Because I don't know, it gives you UBI, it gives you all kinds of things. Do you think that you're going to suffer from this problem in a major way, or has your research led you to believe that this is a measure that is going to stand sort of all these different attempts at attacking it, I suppose?
One of the reasons why we selected or we think that Iris Biometrics is better or is the right path is not just that it fulfills the requirements of it's tamper-proof, it's inclusive, it has enough entropy, but it's actually been like widely studied and widely used for like more than a decade now across the board. And so when a lot of governments have used it for a long time, a lot of identity systems have used it, not in the same private, open source, and decentralized way in which we're using it, but as a signal, it has been a very robust signal. And so I think that for the foreseeable future, it'll be more than sufficient. And then the good thing is, again, the World ID protocol is neutral to that. And so if that needs to be enhanced with or upgraded with superior verification methods in the future, there is that upgradability path, right? Another really interesting property is your World IDs expire just like your license expires, right? Your driver's license. And so to this question of like, okay, what if people die, for example? Well, that World ID will just eventually expire, right? And so there's different mechanisms in place to make sure that the system is self-healing. Another very common question is, well, like what happens if one orb gets compromised? Well, it would be a really dumb protocol if it like dies if one orb gets compromised, because it's hardware. At some point, something will slip through, right? And so the really important thing is that protocol is resistant to things like that. And so, for this specific example, if a specific orb gets compromised, there's actually a mechanism where the community can just simply expire the verifications that were issued by that orb, and the people that have role IDs from that simply return to a different orb to get it. Obviously, with like common sense timelines and things like that. But the protocol is resistant to this type of incidents.
Okay, that's interesting because it relates to sort of an attack vector that Clément talked about, which is that, well, it's sort of just a question of money, or how expensive it is to hack an orb and just produce as many Worldcoin IDs as you want, in a sense, because the output space is so limited. In a sense, you just need to try as many inputs to the orb as you need in order to make it generate valid certificates. Basically, it's more of a cost question, not really a is it possible question. So what you're saying that is that if an orb breaks in that way, the protocol would be resilient to this. Is that
Yeah.
correctly understood? Or yeah, okay,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
okay.
I would definitely disagree that it's something trivial to do, right? But I think the really important part is that if an orb were to get compromised either technically or socially, there are mechanisms to be resilient to that, right? And so one example of that is being able to expire the verifications from a specific orb. Now that's obviously a very important decision that like should not lie in someone random like me, right? But in like some proper governance process. But generally speaking, I do think that the orb is a lot more resilient than perhaps some people imagine.
One widely held criticism that I saw, and I would really be interested in your answer, is the way you've bootstrapped these initial 1.7 million people. There was a pretty negative article by the MIT Technology Review that you've probably seen. They seem to have actually traveled to different places or somehow gotten in contact with places where orbs have been operated, and seemingly people were onboarded without actually giving informed consent about what's happening. And it was more like, hey, you get $20 for signing up or whatever. We're giving away AirPods. Like the article is pretty detailed. Now, you yourself from Mexico, which is sort of emerging country, let's say, what do you make of this narrative that this has been an abusive process of how you've gotten to these 1.7 million? Is this a fair criticism from your perspective, or is this a fundamentally misguided view on how you've been bootstrapping the network?
I mean, I think that what I can say in terms of the article specifically is we actually go on the article itself. There's a link somewhere in there to like a 25-page PDF that are like the responses that we gave to a lot of the questions to the article. And I would say like those like probably like still stand up like quite well today. Um, I think there's a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings in the article, so like I'd rather not get too much into that. But like there's like 25 pages worth of our answers linked directly in the article. Now, I do think it's like part of that is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the let's call it the pre-release period has worked. Right? And so the we've had essentially two phases. We've had the alpha phase and the beta phase. The alpha phase consisted of us literally making orbs by hand in this office I'm actually in right now. And we had at any given point in time between 10 and 12 orbs or 15 orbs sometimes that were like actually operatable. And so what we would do is we would take them around the world to a bunch of different types of places to understand what it would take for the project to succeed in different places. And so anything that's like really obvious, like language or traditions or Wi-Fi signal or LTE, to some more non-obvious things like the weather, right? How does the hardware and how does even like cold affect operations, dust. And so there's all of these different set of just like different variables that we just had to understand to see like, hey, are people around the world interested in this? And if so, what is actually the way you are able to operate in this? And so during that alpha, we had these few orbs, and in the middle of all of that, there was COVID going on. And so we were like hopping around the world, going to a bunch of different places, some like 25 countries, and we learned a ton, right? And once we were done with that, we said, okay, now that we've understood that, or like we've seen what is out there, let's choose almost like 4 archetypes that we think are representative of everything that we've seen. And let's just go really deep in them. And around the same time, we were finally had set up the orb factory. And so we had a lot more orbs to put out. And so what we were able to do was to say, okay, now we can go really deep into these 4 types of cities that we saw around the world. And we know that if we make Worldcoin works in those cities, we feel confident that we can scale it to the world based on what we've seen, based on weather, traditions, language, infrastructure. And so those ended up being Buenos Aires in Argentina, Lisbon in Portugal, Nairobi in Kenya, and Bangalore in India. And we still had, in the cities around those, we had a few orbs. But for the last probably like 8 months or 12 months, I don't even know at this point, we've gone really in depth into these different places to make it work. Right? And so in Lisbon, for example, more than 5% of the population has signed up. And so I think there is generally, for example, a misunderstanding that Worldcoin is focused for the developing markets. Even people that like Worldcoin, they go like, yeah, that's great because like it will help people in developing countries. It's actually not the case. We just think like crypto should be for all, including developing countries, right? And there are different challenges for operating in Mexico City than in like Monterrey in Mexico, than in like New York. And so we've had to like figure out how to navigate different local challenges. But I would say the notion that we are somehow only in like poor countries for some ulterior motive, like that is just like A, factually not correct, and B, I don't even know what like the ulterior motive could be, to be honest. So look, we are in the process of like wrapping up this beta, and then as soon as Worldcoin launches, then we will actually deploy orbs a lot more broadly around the world. And so that's like generally what's happened during the pre-release. Have there been mistakes? Sure, like many, but I don't think anywhere near the degree to which like some people think.
Awesome. Maybe one closing question. Do you have a white hat program? Can people get orbs to try to hack them? and find all the flaws? Are you open to these kinds of things? Can people ask you for orbs?
So people can definitely ask us for orbs. We're actually in the process of finalizing like an official program that will be posted on the site for different parts of the stack. We have already worked behind the scenes on like many audits and many white hat operations, let's call it, behind the scenes. So like happy to like collaborate with anyone. They can just reach out to security at Worldcoin or at toolsforhumanity.com and people will get back there. But yeah, generally super excited to work with the community on this.
Tiago, this has been a real pleasure, and it's always best to talk directly to the people instead of talking about them. I feel I've learned a lot, and I'm super excited that you took the time to talk to us. I'm sure there are going to be other community members that want a piece of you and ask you probably a different set of questions. I'm glad that you were here today and very grateful that you found common ground with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Florian. And like what I would say is, I think like at this point it's very clear that in this new world that we're going, there will be something like Worldcoin, whether it's proof of person or the digital money. I hope that happens to be in a private, decentralized, and open source way, and that's what we're building here. But the future is coming, and we'll have a lot of fun in the coming years.